So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be loved. Love means understanding redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be loved by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be loved by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be loved and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be loved and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be loved and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be loved and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Welcome to our second part of our three-part series on environmental injustice and justice. We are looking forward to this conversation. I'm Dr. Vanetta L. West, Chief Content Officer and Senior Nonviolence Trainer with the King Center. And I just want to share a bit about what happened last week as we talk about this week's conversation. Last week, we defined environmental racism. We talked about what it is, the hazardous material, the placement of those materials in community based on race, class, poverty, status, and how that is harmful to communities, not just in the United States, but around the globe. We also talked about the withholding of things that are needed to be environmentally healthy. That is also environmental racism. And of course, we did that framing it with this quest that we have as the King Center for the Beloved Community. That is our vision, the beloved community where injustice ceases and love prevails. And also framing it in terms of what these beloved community talks are purposed to do. We want these conversations to be strategic, for them to be very detailed in how we share and convey the topics and the issues. This is a space for issue education. But we also want to share action steps. And so in the interest of that, of moving from courageous conversations to compassionate action, in this talk today, we will also convey what's happening globally with environmental injustice and environmental racism. We want to talk about what's happening in other nations, how that's been influenced, how it came to be. And we welcome you from everywhere across the globe. We want to encourage you as we get started right now to share this broadcast. If you're watching on Facebook, we want to invite you to share this broadcast, to host a watch party. I see coming up here Dr. Bernice King for President of the United States in 2024. She'll enjoy that, Jennifer Marie. She'll enjoy that very much and probably say no. So we welcome you from wherever you're joining us from. We want you to, if you're watching this on Twitter, to retweet the broadcast. If you're on YouTube, copy that link and share the broadcast. And as you're sharing about what we convey here in this conversation, please use hashtag BCT, hashtag Beloved Community Talks, hashtag Courageous Conversations. Welcome from Alabama. Have some people joining us from Alabama, my home state. We're grateful for all of you who are joining, who are tuning in. So you're aware too, she wasn't on our flyer, on our graphic for this Beloved Community Talk, but our CEO, Dr. Bernice King, will be joining us at the end of this broadcast for 10 to 15 minutes. So we want to invite you to be a part of that as well. We're grateful for this unexpected but certainly welcome part of our beloved community talk today. Now, I'm saying today because we're a global organization. We believe this is a global broadcast. So, in different parts of the world, it's a different time. And as we're talking about global perspectives on environmental racism, we don't want to miss that this is a topic that impacts, harms, devastates. It's an issue that concerns us all across the world. And we want to share with you as well that World House is a phrase from Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? We want to encourage you to read that book. It's a chapter in that book called World House, where he reminds us that we have to learn to live together. And one of the things that's impeding us from living together the way that we should is what he called one of the triple evils. He talked about three triple evils: racism, poverty, and militarism. Well, environmental racism is a part of racism overall. It's a form of discrimination. So as we have this discussion, we want to be sure we highlight this is about our World House, global perspectives on environmental racism, and we want to now invite our panel on. We have an esteemed group of panelists, conversationalists who will guide us in talking about this topic, but also give us some insight on some action steps and what we can do to change the trajectory of our World House. That's critical because, again, we want to do courageous conversations plus compassionate action. So our first panelist I want to introduce is Jackie Patterson. Jackie Patterson is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project. And so we want to welcome Jackie Patterson. And after I introduce all of the panelists, we'll bring them all on and they'll have a moment to share just a bit more about themselves. Welcome, Jackie. You'll see her in just a moment. Bill McKibben is joining us. Bill McKibben is an author, an educator, activist, founder of Third Act. You'll see Bill in just a moment. We also want to welcome Dr. Fatima Shafi. She's a director of environmental studies and associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Spelman College, right here in Metro Atlanta, where we are. And then finally, we have joining us Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, Executive Vice President of Conservation and Justice for the National Wildlife Federation, Interim Chief of Programs at the Union of Concerned Scientists, CEO of Revitalization Strategies. Welcome, Dr. Santiago Ali. Now we'll have all of our panelists come on and join us and just take a moment to share something about themselves. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for being a part of this very important conversation.
Thank you.
Excited to have you. We'll start with you, Jackie. Take 1 to 2 minutes and share anything you want to share about yourself as we get started.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. So first, it's just an honor to be here with you all. I appreciate being invited, and I appreciate just the wonderful panelists that I'm sharing the screen with. I was born on the south side of Chicago, my mom came to Chicago through the Great Migration from Dublin, Mississippi in the Delta, which is actually where I am right now. And my dad came to Chicago from Jamaica, where he was born and raised, Jamaica, West Indies. And I grew up not knowing that I was surrounded by coal-fired power plants. I was within a 10-mile radius of 3 of the most polluting coal-fired power plants in the country. I didn't know when the kids in my class, so many of the kids in my class had asthma. So many of the folks in our church had respirators, what I was growing up around. Yet at the same time, we had beloved community. We had a beautiful community where we all ran and played together, where we took each other Miss so and so a plate, for dinner, and we also really enjoyed our Jamaican culture. Always had Jamaican reggae parties at my house every evening. So we had that kind of mix of not really knowing the threats around us so much, but also knowing the love and what it looks like to be in community, to be in a cooperative community together. So yeah, I'll that's just a little bit about me on a personal side. You'll hear more about work stuff as we progress. So thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Bill.
Well, Dr. West, what a pleasure to get to be here. What a pleasure to get to see old friends on this panel. Um, and and really, greetings from Vermont. Today's actually a good day to be thinking about global crisis, at least here in the Northeast, because the wildfire smoke from Canada is choking the Northeast. I've been talking to friends in New York who say the emergency rooms are just filled up with kids with asthma who are having attacks today because the air is so bad. And it's a reminder that there are no boundaries. I've been actually thinking about that all week because I've been spending much of the week working, trying to get an old and dear friend out of jail in Vietnam, one of the great activists in Asia, my friend Hong, who's been, she coordinated so many of the protests that we've done in that part of the world. And now she's in jail because the government doesn't like her. And it's a reminder over and over and over again that this is a global crisis, that it's a crisis of extraordinary injustice. The iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the harder and the sooner you get hit by it. And that it's going to require an absolutely global solution. The good news is that there are people in every corner of the planet at work on it. The bad news is the fossil fuel industry is in every corner of the planet at work on it too. So it's a tussle, and today's one of those days when it feels like our backs are to the wall.
Thank you, Bill. Welcome. Dr. Shafi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting, and it is wonderful to be among friends, even though I don't get to see you often. And if you can see from my accent, I'm originally from Iran, and I came to United States to study, and then the trajectory of my life changed due to other things. And my passion for environmental justice was very much shaped when I was in graduate school and the Bhopal tragedy happened. I don't call it accident because accident is something that you don't anticipate to happen, but there were so many flaws in that plant. It was a matter of time. And I saw it, I read about it and saw how it unfolded. And it was a poster child of environmental justice, where the poor were dying that fateful night in December 1984. The rich were fleeing the city. So the suffering was very much socialized, but the financial benefit from the plant was very much privatized. Those people who really enjoyed the benefit did not suffer from the effect of the disaster. And today it's very unique because yesterday marked the 50th year anniversary of the World Environmental Day, which was, I think, created by the UN in the Stockholm Conference in 1972 and was first celebrated in 1973. And it is 50 years later, and we see that the issue that was raised by Indira Gandhi at that conference, because the conference was so narrow, it only focused on environment, and which really brought a lot of dissent from third world countries. And Indira Gandhi made a passionate speech saying that poverty was the worst pollution. And so the division in that conference very much, some of the vocabulary and the principle that we see really where the foundation was laid in that fateful conference. The they shared uh, the common but differentiated responsibilities that we see coming up in different UN conference on climate really distinguishes that even though, we are facing all these problems like climate change, but our responsibility in creating this problem totally is different. And unfortunately, as I said, 50 years after that day, we see that the problem persists, and environmental racism is still very much alive. And so I'm going to stop. At,
Thank you, Dr. Shafi. Welcome. Dr. Santiago Ali.
Well, it's an honor and a blessing to be here with family and making new friends. I was raised in two places. I was raised in Appalachia, in West Virginia, to be exact, and Detroit. And I was blessed, that I was raised in a family of folks who worked on both civil rights and worker rights issues. And my grandfather used to have those conscientious conversations as men would come from all across the counties to gather on his porch, and had the opportunity to learn some lessons there. But a part of those lessons were also similar to Jackie, an old coal-fired power plant, which was right across the river. And when the emissions would blow into our community, we used to just call it the fog. So when we were out playing, we had no idea about the exposures that we were dealing with or the toxic metals that were in our water. And when you fast forward a little while, we started to notice that a lot of younger men and women were starting to pass away from various cancers. So that's a part of my journey and why we do the work that we do. I started working on social justice issues when I was 16, and I was blessed to be mentored and taught by a number of folks, both in the civil rights movement and the early environmental justice movement. So I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight with so many luminaries.
Thank you so much. Welcome, Dr. Santiago Ali. Welcome again to each of you. I mean, even in your introductions, you shared things that I want to quickly get back to. One of the things you said, Bill, is that I'm going to paraphrase. You said that the least blameful, or the ones who are least responsible for climate change and the climate crisis and environmental injustice are often the most impacted. I wanted to start talking about that and why that is, as we consider this, as well as we talk about the World House and creating the beloved community. That one of the things that we have to face is that we can't talk about this climate crisis and global environmental injustice unless we talk about the impacts of racism and colonialism and imperialism, all these isms that have harmed communities and peoples across the globe. Does that have something to do with, as we talk about it, the least responsible being the most impacted? I'll start with you, Dr. Santiago Ali. I see as I asked that question, all of you were like, well, yeah, let's get into that.
Well, you got to go back to the roots of what all this is about. A lot of times we skate around everything. It's about extraction. It has been colonialism is founded on extraction, and now we see it playing out today in our lives. We had the extraction of our indigenous brothers and sisters from their land, losing, even though they weren't concerned with the trillions of dollars of wealth that was tied up into the land. They followed that first principle of environmental justice long before we ever put those words down on paper. When we said that, EJ affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. So when we follow this paradigm of extracting people from Africa as well, and being brought to this country, once again, for free labor, that ties into worker justice rights. When we take people away from their traditional foods, that is food justice and food insecurity, a part of that dynamic that's going on. So we really got to be honest about the history of how we got to this moment, about the policies that were put in place, both for those actions of taking our indigenous brothers and sisters from their land, of snatching brothers and sisters from Africa and bringing them to this country, of the redlining and restrictive covenants that then push people into certain areas. And we see these dynamics. We see other governments also, and sometimes taking some of the sins that we have had in the past and incorporating them into the way that they've done business as well. So until we, one, understand the extractive mentality that's going on in sets of actions and how it is tied and infused into policy, which then touches everything from housing to transportation to jobs to the banking system to voting, then we are missing what this is really all about. And the last thing I'll say as I pass the mic is that you cannot win on climate change if you don't win on environmental injustice or environmental racism. And we still have some folks who have not yet evolved into the positioning of understanding the connection that exists, both in addressing the impacts, but also embracing this new set of opportunities that we have in front of us.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think, Bill, what you said is true. When I look at nations, like for instance, the flooding that we're seeing in Nigeria, that in Africa, these nations and peoples had very little to do, if anything, with climate change and the climate crisis, but they are facing the most impact. Can we even, to each of you, and to highlight what Dr. Santiago Ali just said, if we don't start to teach about the effects of colonialism and extraction and imperialism and the effects they've had on the world, how would we even address the climate crisis or environmental racism? I want to pose that first to you, Bill, but then to Dr. Shafi and Jackie as well.
Well, it's just the right question. And of course, the brother of extraction is consumption. And, that's when you talk about global warming, that's what really starts to show up. So just think about the numbers for a minute. The entire continent of Africa has produced something between 2 and 3% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, all the carbon dioxide and methane and things, because people are not driving SUVs, building giant homes, on and on and on. They've produced 2 or 3% of the problem, of the cause of the problem, but they're suffering some huge percentage of the damage. It's that flooding in Nigeria and Malawi. It's the drought in across sub-Saharan Africa. It's we've even had. The weather has been positively biblical at times. Last year, across much of Africa, we had the biggest plague of locusts that we've ever seen, and it was tied to these dramatic shifts in the weather. Not just Africa. Pakistan had the biggest floods probably since Noah last August and September. 33 million people displaced, but all of Pakistan, 200 million people, produces maybe 1% of all. In this country, we've produced 25% of all the greenhouse gases in the air. We've been doing it for years. The stuff that came out of the back of my family's Plymouth Fury when I was getting my learner's permit, still up in the air, trapping heat. And it, of course, follows race and lines of race and class in this country, too. But you really get an enormous sense of it when you think about the globe as a whole.
Thank you. I want you, if you're tuning in, before we go to Dr. Shafi, to write down these words: consumption, extraction, colonialism. Consider the things we're sharing here, because we want to educate on this issue. And oftentimes there's a disconnect because we're thinking, oh, the climate crisis has nothing to do with racism. It has nothing to do with colonialism, but it does. And if you look at the stats, the amount of harm that we're causing in the environment, 25% Bill just shared in the air from this nation. Think about how we're causing harm that's impacting people around the globe. And if we can do something to stop it, why not? Dr. Shafi.
Well, I concur with Bill and all of us in environmental justice, and also Brother Dr. Santiago Ali. that indeed the entrenched inequity of climate justice is the poster child of the displaced hardship. And when we look at the worst effect of global warming, we see that it is falling on the shoulders of the very people who were least responsible for contributing the problem. And the disparity in terms of the effect of shocks and vulnerability um, is what Desmond Tutu called adaptation apartheid, because not only that we created the problem, we really did not allow, we didn't allow them, those community to have resources to really, we talk about resilience and other things, to really be able to adapt or build resiliency. And that is the second problem that we created. And I think if you go back again to the impassioned speech of Indira Gandhi, that we see that the same, yes, these are all common problems, but then there are differentiated responsibilities. And we really, it's not like we don't have studies. We have so many studies, science-based studies, that really talks about all these disparities, environmental racism, the root cause, all of that. But there is, what is lacking is the political will to bring change. And so we know these problems. We know PM 2.5 is really impacting, which is a co-pollutant with the greenhouse gases. African American are worst impacted by PM 2.5, which is really the biggest threat, air pollutant, for the threat to people's health. But we are not doing anything.
Sister Bernetta, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. We talked about will, Dr. Shafi, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said we have the resources to end poverty, but not the will. And it sounds as though it's very true that that's the case with environmental racism, which is, of course, akin to, connected to poverty, as it is connected to militarism. Jackie, I want you to have the opportunity to answer this question, and then I want to quickly go into another question for you. So,
absolutely. Yeah, I just want to bring in a couple of complementary statistics to the ones that were stated before. As was stated, the U.S. is responsible historically for 25% of the pollutants that drive climate change, and we are 4% of the global population. Mm-hmm. Africa is responsible for 2 to 3% of the emissions. Africa is 17% of the global population. Mm-hmm. So that's where, in that, we see the extreme disparity and the extreme injustice in terms of impacts. I was just on a part of a People's Health Tribunal, where people from South Africa, the Niger Delta, Uganda, and I said South Africa, but yeah, and other places were speaking about the impacts of Shell Oil and Total Energies in their communities, and just the same way as we are treating, as these corporations in particular and rich nations are treating the earth with disregard, is the same way that they're treating, as we talk about environmental racism, Black communities, in particular Black nations, with this disregard. You heard story after heartbreaking story after story of people whose homes were being polluted, of people who were being displaced by development all around, the extraction of oil in their communities, and people who had lost family members because of the heartlessness. And yet, that if this was, but they do this kind of in the knowing that they're doing it undercover, that people don't know what's going on there, and they have just literally a heartless disregard for the humanity. And we talked about the transatlantic, the passage of Black folks from the continent to the U.S., recognizing that we were in the hulls of ships as cargo, again, all of these are these dehumanizing factors, a total disregard for the health and well-being of people and the health and well-being of the planet. And this is where we see a common cause around environmental racism and just the scourging of the earth itself. So just really wanted to make those kind of points and connections there.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a reminder, Jackie, of something Yvette Carnell said on last week's Beloved Community Talk. I want to encourage everyone to watch that on the King Center's YouTube channel. But she said that it was easy to place pollutants in Black communities because we were seen as pollutants. And in some cases still are. So it's that the psychology of it all is, let's harm the people that we consider less than anyway. One of the things that Dr. King said in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he talked about us destroying ourselves in the misuse of our own instruments. As we shift a bit to talk about slow violence, that violence that happens over time that harms the environment and harms humanity, how is that happening as a result of the misuse of the instruments we've created as human beings, Jackie?
Starting. Okay. Sorry. I was just recovering from having spoken before. So the slow violence, yes. We were at the UN climate talks, COP21, I think was mentioned before, and the youth that were there from HBCUs did a Black Lives Matter action. They did a die-in there, and they really invoked the phrasing and the movement for Black lives, and very much said that just as much as we're being shot down on the streets as Black people, that we're dying the death of 1,000 cuts from the polluting of our communities. So this notion of slow violence. And arguably how slow it is, but the rampant and deep violence that's occurring in our communities. And of course, as I talked about the story upon story after story at the People's Health Tribunal, similarly, just the violence that's the outright violence is being done against communities, but then also just the blatant disregard. Like, we're going to do what we're going to do regardless of the fact that it's killing people. So yeah, those are a few kind of illustrative examples that I would put forward. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, because some people would say, and I often hear, we have to use these things that we use. But what we often say at the King Center is we have rights, but we also have responsibilities. How are we slacking on our responsibilities, Dr. Santiago Ali? We know we have to have stuff, but at this point, we're irresponsible at an alarming rate. And how is that harming us? And then how do we kind of harness that kind of notion? I have rights, but also look at how irresponsibility is harming our environment and harming us.
Well, I think that we have to once again look at the roots of irresponsibility and be careful of making some assumptions that people are, one, educated about what's happening to them and how that's playing out, and the power that they have to make change happen. We often have these important conversations about climate, and we have important conversations about parts per million and parts per trillion, but that doesn't mean a whole lot to Mrs. Ramirez or Mr. Johnson. People don't actually have an understanding of the dynamics of what's going on in our country. So let me take it from the domestic to the international, if that would be helpful. So in our country, we'll talk about air pollution, since it's one of the drivers of what's happening in relationship to the climate crisis. We know, based upon a study from Harvard, that over 300,000 people are dying prematurely each year in our country from air pollution. That's more people who are dying from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. I'll hold for a second. That's more people who are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. You can't turn the TV on without hearing about the importance of what's happening in relationship to gun violence. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from overdoses of drugs. So let's make sure that we then take it to the international. We've got 7 to 9 million people who are dying prematurely from air pollution. So I want folks to think about your favorite stadium, and let's just assume that football stadium, basketball stadium, whatever it might be, holds 100,000 people. So we're talking about every time that thing fills up, 70 to 90 times, all those people, when you would look around, if you're sitting in that space, now gone. and they're gone because of air pollution. We know that in our country, we got 24 to 25 million people who have asthma. We know that there's 260 plus million people across our planet who have asthma, and 500,000 people die every year from that. So the question becomes, Dr. West, for people, it's like they have to be able to see themselves reflected in something before we can ask there to be actual responsibility in addressing the problem. And we know that traditionally, when we were talking about environmental impacts and climate impacts, we were not including folks of color in that discussion. We were not including in the representation lower wealth white communities. We were not having indigenous brothers and sisters as a part of the imagery of who was being impacted. In our country, we know that we got 60 million people who've dealt with unsafe drinking water, and pollution is playing a role with that. Everything from what's happening on our farms to what's being dumped from plants, so forth and so on. And we know that we've got 1.2 million folks who lose their life every year across our planet because of unsafe drinking water. So then we bring into that conversation what happened in Flint, or what has happened in Jackson, Mississippi, or what has happened in Tanzania, or what has happened in Nigeria or South Africa, or a number of other locations I could talk about. Because if people don't see themselves represented, then we can't ask for there to be responsibility in the sets of actions and power that is tied to how we utilize our dollars. And if we are blessed to be in a country that allows us to vote, and if that vote actually has meaning, then that's why I'm real careful about saying that folks are irresponsible if they don't know. My grandmother says, when you know better, do better. So we got to make sure that people know better if we expect there to be an action to change.
I hear you. That's powerful, Dr. Santiago Ali, because what you're saying is true. We haven't seen ourselves in climate crisis. And often, if we talk about today, things that are happening in countries that are African nations or Latin nations, we still don't make the connection or talk about how do we see communities that have already been systemically harmed in this. How are they a part of not only being harmed by it, but a part of the solution? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I'll be very brief. We allow people to put these wedges between our communities. People love to try and break up Black and brown and indigenous communities so that they continue to do the things that they have always done. So when we see the migration of people, right? So when we see those brothers and sisters trying to have a better life, just like folks who jumped on ships and came from Europe over here, but people are now walking, they're walking from Central America and they're walking through Mexico to our borders. There is a reason. There are drivers that are a part of that. And one of those drivers is the climate crisis. You have the migration of people that is happening also in Africa now. You have the migration of people inside of this country as well. Jackie can talk about it all day long, whether we look at what's happening with indigenous brothers and sisters off the coast of Louisiana, or if we've seen some of these other climate crises that have moved people. You can go to Katrina and see what happened there, where people went to Texas and a number of other locations and then couldn't come back home. And there were a number of reasons why that played out. It wasn't that folks didn't want to come back home. There were difficulties and barriers that were placed in front of them that stopped that. So the migration is another dynamic, and it should be an opportunity for us to come together. So be very careful of how people will try and separate us so that we can't be as powerful as we need to be to address where the root causes are coming from.
Wow. So let's pose this question, because in Kingian thinking, and this is for all of you, starting with Bill, there are three things we look at, three I's we call them: interconnectedness, interdependence, and interrelatedness. And Dr. Santiago Ali just touched on all three of those. But as we talk about, Bill, educating and being sure that we're aware and we don't stay where we are with this climate crisis, how can we compel our world house to remember that we're interconnected, we're interdependent, we're interrelated? And how would that help us shift to make the changes necessary?
Well, I think we may do it to some degree by action. It's such an incredible honor to be at the King Center, if only virtually, because in certain ways it brings us back to the 20th century for a minute. And I think there were two great inventions. I think history will remember the 20th century for two great inventions. One of them was the solar panel, which is now the cheapest. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a water into wine miracle that gives us some real chance now to make fast progress in lots of places. The other great invention of the 20th century was the nonviolent social movement. And, some of it came from India and some of it came from Dr. King and, James Lawson and Bob Moses and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and on and on and on. And that technology, as it were, that way for the small and the many to stand up to the mighty and the few, is what we desperately need if we're going to spread that solar panel around the world with the speed that's required. If we're going to take down the power that the the powers and the principalities, as they say, that the fossil fuel industry represents, that's what we need. And that's why it's been so beautiful to watch that. I have 350.org, which I started. We've organized demonstrations now in every country on earth except North Korea. So I can tell you that there are lots of people everywhere who are standing up to try and make this kind of change, including right here in this country. Day after tomorrow, I'll be in DC, probably getting arrested because people are trying to stop this pipeline down across Appalachia. That's what it's taken in the past, and that's what it'll take getting forward if we're going to mesh all this history with all this possibility in order to make the kind of change that we have to make and this is the hard part, in the time that we have to make it. Because climate change is a time test. The most comforting thing that Dr. King would ever say always was, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This may take a while, but we're going to win. The arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. If we don't win this fight soon, then we don't win it. So that's why the pressure seems so on all the time.
We have us a new word, folks. We're learning about a number of things, and hopefully, thank you for that, Bill. Thank you, Dr. Santiago Ali, Jackie, Dr. Shafi. I'll come to you in a moment with that same question. Hopefully, as you're taking notes and as you're doing research, Google is amazing. The ability to type in things like, what can I personally do about the climate crisis? So we don't want to talk about a lot of things that you could Google here, but I want to ask some questions about what our thinking should shift to. And I've heard a lot about what our thinking should shift to, being more expansive and understanding from Dr. Santiago Ali, thinking about some other concepts about the impact versus the being the causer of it from Jackie and Bill. And Dr. Shafi, I want to ask you a similar question to what Bill just answered. What are the tangible things as we look at what's happening now, starting with our thinking? What do you think we need to do to shift our perception of environmental injustice and climate change to maybe that's not my problem, to how do I see it? How do we become more inclusive, as Dr. Santiago Ali was pointing out, in how we frame this issue and talk about it?
I think one of the things that first of all, thank you for having this forum, because the moral authority that the King Center has globally is a big force that would energize this movement beyond what all of us can imagine. Because I remember as a child how excited we were when we were hearing, my families were hearing about Dr. King's and what he did in the United States. So what the civil rights leaders do in this country echoes around the world, and I think animates people to bring changes. I think one of the first things we need to do is to change the narrative around the discourse of that narrative around the solution. because we keep framing this issue as an environmental issue, which is really a very reductionist approach to the issue. And it is really, we need to broaden it. It is an intersectional issue. It is a civil rights issue. It's a human rights issue. And even the environmental justice movement, when you look at the environmental justice movement, you see that it is really environmental movement. It is a social justice movement. It is economic justice movement, and they are coming together, and then it becomes an environmental justice movement. So if we broaden it, because what we are doing, I'm going to be fast because I know we are running out of time. The way we are approaching this problem is like we're looking at digital clock. When you look at the digital clock, you see that second. But when you look at the analog clock, you see the past where the hands was and where the hand is going. And that gives us a broader perspective on how the problem started, like the legacy of colonialism, slavery, and all kind of ism, and where it needs to go. And if you look at as my colleague and my esteemed leaders on this said, that we keep the word hearing, I have said it before, we keep the word hearing the word vulnerabilities. And then we keep talking about as if the vulnerabilities are in the DNA of BIPOC communities. Vulnerabilities that we see today were really the result of centuries of, policies, practices, guidelines, actions that have created, as brother Dr. Mustafa Ali said, redlining happened over 100, almost 100 years ago. But look at the legacy of redlining today. We see, George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," but that has been a cry that all of us knew in the EJ community that is happening. We see Freddie, die in Freddie Gray die the night of his encounter, but he already lost with his lead poisoning. He was already the victim of slow violence before that fateful night. How can we stitch these connect and make connection around these issues? Because I don't want to link them. I want to stitch them because then they would not be separated. So we can really look at it in a holistic way, not in a compartmentalized way. When we look at the environment as an isolated, operating in silo from the rest of other vulnerability. I'm going to stop. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Shafi. I mean, I've heard intersectionality applied in some other ways, but I do think it's very important that we think about the economic implications. The stitching, you said you didn't want to, you want to stitch it together, and that's true economically, environmentally, racially, relationally, all these different aspects of this issue. Jackie, would you expound on that a bit when we consider globally what's happening with the climate crisis, with this stitching? How are you seeing it manifest, and what do you think we can do as an approach to not just addressing it, but beginning to deconstruct and really educate on changes we can make?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I want to echo what Sister Fatima said in terms of shifting the narrative. I think we need to shift the narrative to expand around what possibilities actually are. What we need to also shift and expand our vision of what's possible, because what we're doing now is just making minor tweaks at a system that's fundamentally flawed, that's doing exactly what it was designed to do: concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a very few, and at the expense of the planet and so many of the people. And so COVID-19, as tragic as it was, and I would never wish for it to ever happen. And at the same time, it also taught us what was possible when we're pushed against the wall. Winston Churchill said that you can always count on America to do the right thing once they've exhausted all other possibilities. And we saw that with COVID-19, that we had universal basic income. We had a revolutionizing of mutual aid. We became local makers, like all the things that we need in order to be able to have a planet that survives and a people that survives. We recognize that there is abundance, that we can grow, that we can stop driving and shipping and trucking all over the place. We recognize what it could be, what it could be if we just bound together and saw, as you said, in terms of stitching, saw that we're all in the same river, and that we're and there's interdependence in order for us to thrive together, and it's possible for us to thrive together. And so I'll rest there, but I do think that we need to practice that. We need to see that radical imagination isn't so radical, that we actually, it's a proven concept in terms of what we were able to do for that brief time.
Yeah. Radical imagination. One of the things we wanted to highlight is we can't build sustainability for some and not try to build it for all. So we don't want to work in silos saying we want justice in this area, as we believe, and of course, our namesake said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So if we get justice in some places, we can start to work it out everywhere. I want to just express on behalf of Dr. King our gratitude for you joining us for this conversation. I want to, before you exit this panel, bring on Dr. King. She's going to join us for the next segment. So we'll bring her on, and then you'll have a moment just to see her and greet her, and then we'll shift out of this conversation. But to you, Bill, thank you so much. Dr. Fatima, thank you so much. Jackie, thank you so much. Dr. Santiago Ali, thank you. We're grateful for you being with us. And we want to bring on now, as we shift a bit, want to keep this panel here for a moment, bring on Dr. Bernice A. King, CEO of the King Center, thought leader,
good evening,
all around
everybody.
Greatness. Dr. King, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here tonight, and I want to thank all of our guests for joining us and educating us. I always tell people I'm still in the learning phase. So many people around this world, especially in leadership, need to sit at you all's feet because we influence so many people. And as you know, people follow leaders. And so we need more leadership in this area to ensure that all of us are participating in moving our world in a more healthy and sustainable way. So I give my love and my heart to you, and I hope that we will stay connected in some way. I know we're going to continue to push this issue. It's particularly as it relates to the Black community, and the Indigenous community is always educating us. We learn from them, and other communities of color, because we have a lot to learn in this regard. And so I want to thank you all for your contributions on tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. We look forward to having you back. We have a Beloved Community Global Summit in January. Now, I'll be reaching out. We're hoping that we can continue this conversation and develop some action items that we can share with people across the globe to start to move the dial and see some change, some tangible change in this area. So Dr. Santiago Ali, Dr. Shafi, Bill, Jackie, thank you again for joining us for this Beloved Community Talk.
And thank you for inviting us. And
you're welcome. You're welcome. We're going to shift now to Dr. Bernice A. King and a conversation about happenings here in Atlanta, Dr. King, that are very much connected to much of what we just talked about. And so we had here in Metro Atlanta, in the city of Atlanta, early this morning after hours of public comments,
Yeah.
an Atlanta City Council vote to construct what is officially called the Public Safety Training Center. But the name most commonly used is Cop City. And so, given that decision, I know you wanted to share and convey your heart. We wanted to have a brief discussion as we conclude this beloved community talk about the trajectory of this city and of the nation, and just some higher thinking about what we can create if we listen to each other. Your father said we have to learn to live together, and we often talk about what it means to learn to live together. I wanted to start there. Based on what we're witnessing here in Atlanta, what is our deficit in learning? How are we failing to learn to live together?
Well, before I do that, I just want to clarify a point that yesterday or early this morning, really, the City Council in Atlanta voted to provide the funding that they have been asked to provide,
absolutely,
which is taxpayers' dollars, for the construction of this public safety training facility, as many of those who have been opposed to it have named it Cop City, and they've named it that way because there are elements of this construction that are like a mock city, supposedly to give space and room for those who are being trained to learn in a kind of assimilation sort of fashion, as if it were happening in a city. My understanding is that there is another public safety training facility in the state of Georgia. It's under the auspices of the state. In I think it's Forsyth, Georgia. So there is a state-of-the-art facility in our state that was brought up in the public hearing last night. In fact, and many critical questions are being raised. But when you're talking about these issues that oftentimes are very controversial and people don't see eye to eye, I think the work that we as an institution do and what Martin Luther King was trying to usher in is helping us to understand at the core of everything is about the dignity of the person. When he was studying at Boston University, one of the areas of focus was about personalism and something about the sacredness of the human person in everything that he did, everything he taught. And what seems to be lacking in today's society as businesses make decisions in concert with governmental entities in municipalities, in counties, is that there's often not a process that includes true engagement with the community where we listen, because part of learning is listening and opening your heart to understanding and taking into consideration what those who may not fully understand or agree with that you are trying to do. And that means sometimes you can't take the road of being expedient or the road of trying to do what's going to be popular and get you the prize, but you do what's right by humankind, because the world, as you talk about the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, the God of this universe honors certain things. And those things that seem oftentimes to be insurmountable, the power of God and the universe comes to bear when you honor some basic things like dignity, and respect and compassion and love. When you operate out of that love-centered approach, you may feel like you have a deficit of something in the material realm, but God has a way of opening up doors so those very resources begin to become available. Your eyesight begins to become even open to other possibilities. And I think that's why Daddy said we don't have the will, is because we haven't opened our heart up, to truly understanding the other perspective, the other side, and the cries of the people. I mean, what pained me about what happened yesterday, regardless of which way they were choosing to vote. I think the vote was like 11-4.
That's right.
I think it was 11-4.
It
But
was.
but what pained me about it was not just how they voted. What really pained me was that this was the second time in 3 weeks that people came before the city council. Not everybody, let me be clear. There were some people there that were not speaking the language of nonviolence and dignity. But the majority of the people who came before came with facts in hand. They came not just with emotion, they came with reason, and they came with passion. Some even ended by saying, "I love you," and at the end of the day, it was as if we're just going to do this so we can check it off the list and say we had a listening session with the citizens. That's not what people want. That's placating. People want to say, okay, you listen to me long enough to push the pause button and take into, because you can't take into consideration everything that was said yesterday. It was a lot. And if you don't have, which most elected officials don't have the knowledge and the information, like I was saying earlier, around environmental harm, environmental injustice, environmental racism, if you don't fully get and understand that, that's one of the main reasons you say, let me pause for a minute, and let me sit with this, because that pause in and of itself would have been less of a blow to the people who felt like they were rejected and once again ignored, and what they are concerned about it doesn't matter and they don't matter. It would have lessened the blow, and they would have said, well, at least they gave us the dignity of the process. There was no dignity in the process. Just saying, I'm going to allow you to sit here and talk, it's much more comprehensive than that. And especially in light of the temperatures being so high in the city with the recent, raid that occurred at the home of those who providing bail money. We know historically there were those that provided bail to my father. I mean, when I think about a lot of stuff that's happening right now, my father would have been some of these people, not the violent ones, because my father never condoned it. I don't condone violence. I don't think it is the way that you try to achieve true justice. I don't think it's the pathway to creating a beloved community, a just, humane, equitable, and peaceful society. And it certainly is not the way to get people to truly open themselves to hearing, understanding, and perhaps seeking to change their mind about something. And so, here we are now on the back end. And I want to encourage those who are continuing to fight this fight, as difficult as it seems. Violence is never the answer, and I get it. The argument always comes back to us, but why don't you speak against the violence of the state? We're speaking to all of the violence. What they did on Wednesday with that raid, that was violent, to take in a SWAT team based off of some allegations of charitable fraud and other things like that.
Money laundering, yeah.
Money laundering. I mean, to send out a SWAT team, it was just, it's chilling, because it just seems as a person of reason that as I look at the way these things have built up and what's happening, we are trying to create an environment where people don't feel comfortable exercising their First Amendment right to protest, free speech. We're trying to chill all of that in this country and neutralize people, neuter the whole process. And so that's why it's important that we have to make sure that we stay on the high plane, as Daddy said in the I Have a Dream speech, the high plane of discipline and dignity, so that at the end of the day, the people who continue to do the violent things from the state, because violence is more than just physical. Violence is also, I shut you off, I don't hear you. Some of what happened last night, the action that was taken immediately after those 8 hours, that way of doing it as a representative, and not even saying, hey, we're going to take into consideration and take 2 days. There's nothing more important than the dignity of a person. There's nothing that urgent in the world. You can take it a week, you can take 5 days, you can take 3 days, and so when you don't, that's a form of violence, and violence only begets violence, and it becomes descending and descending and descending, and we never get to the right outcome. And at the end of the day, we have to live together in this city. And so we have to find a way to truly engage each other and coexist in a fashion where we listen and learn and approach it in a more humble fashion. Because I don't care how long you've been in business. I don't care how long you may have been an activist. We all should remain humble enough to be in a growing and a learning posture, but not to the face of accepting injustice. We never do that. We never compromise on injustice. But what we do is we don't allow ourselves to try to defeat, damn, and destroy people, because at the end of the day, there are more of those people. So the energy that you need is to try to change things from being unjust to being just, because if all the energy is toward trying to attack those people, you get depleted rapidly. And then the very thing you're saying you're against, you're becoming like. So in other words, you're fighting injustice, but now you're becoming unjust in your actions as well.
Thank you, Dr. King. As we think about the beloved community, I think that one of the key purpose for these beloved community talks is to provide people with a vision of what we can look like if we live together. I believe that is that, promised land your dad talked about in his speech the night before he was assassinated. I've been to the promised land. I've seen. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and part of that vision is there are things that are threatening us, as a humanity, and that's what people are trying to raise in the midst of, those who try to muddy the waters, while some people are trying to make it kill these environmental harms, it's going to affect us. Any man's death diminishes me, as Daddy said. So these environmental concerns, although it may not even be obvious today, they're years later that this stuff we discover, and at that point it's too late. We've lost lives, we've compromised lives. The quality of people's lives, has been compromised. And so, we do have to try to do the right thing. And to me, the right thing is to take a little time and not always go on the path of expediency, and as I said, and I still say it, when I don't care who you are, whatever leadership position you're in, what does conscience say is the right thing to do in this situation? So we have to be thoughtful, and that thoughtfulness in learning to live together is seeing that person as a part of your human family. Seeing this global issue in Atlanta, as difficult as it is, we have police officers. Maybe there is an issue around lacking in the number of them. Maybe there is an issue around police morale. I don't know. But you have to balance all these interests and say, okay, this is difficult. Is there something that we can do that can not, be as feeding into the cycle of this whole notion of militarism of the police? Is it really needed? Well, I mean, there's so many questions that I always want to ask. Is it, what is the purpose of this? What is the outcome we're going to get to? Because at the end of the day, we all know that most times when law enforcement shows up is after the fact, or very seldom before or during. And it's not that we don't need law enforcement. I always tell people, I believe we have to have what represents that in some areas. But the majority of what we're dealing with now is we've got to reimagine, recreate something that didn't start out from the right foundation in the first place. And it's just been built upon. It's a bad thing that we just kept building upon instead of saying, okay, we got to redo this. This is not the way it's done. And that's what people.
Eventually, Dr. King, I think we'll have to have a conversation potentially in this space as we, close this conversation out. But considering what you just said, I believe we need to explore the difference between policing, which
Right.
has a very negative connotation, law enforcement, which if laws are not just or if they're imposed unjustly, if it's a just law, is a problem too, and public safety.
Public safety. 3 different things.
3 different things. We got to talk about it.
Clear again.
Yeah.
3 different things.
3 different things. Policing, which means there's a control, there's an attempt to put me in a box and make me be what you want me to be. Law enforcement, which is if a law is unjust or if a law is used and applied unjustly, then that's a problem. It's also problematic if certain people have laws enforced against them and others don't. So
but also if laws, if just laws are violated too.
Right.
You do have to have parameters for, because you can't just let murderers, people intent on killing people just run free. You can't let people trying to carjack people just run free. But we also have to look at what is at the core of all of that. Some people are going to continue to be criminal minded, but that's not the majority. And so we got to look at the conditions that we have created as a nation that would even produce, as Daddy said, the beggar, that would produce those who would want to take people's lives. What is it fundamental in our society that creates that and perpetuates that? And what is it that we need to be thoughtful about shifting that? Because we know when you adjust certain things, socially, when people feel respected, they feel a sense of dignity and that means in their labor, their work, their wages, in their housing, all that kind of stuff. There's a whole different approach to life, But then, like you said, the other factor, public safety, and we have to expand what public safety means.
Absolutely.
Most people means, safety in terms of those crimes we're talking about. But this environmental issue is a safety issue as well. It's our health and well-being.
It's a safety issue. There's many things to explore on that, and I think the King Center, we could have a conversation on that, and we should, because it would be helpful to look at and to also ask this question. I think a lot of what people are struggling with and opposed to concerning the construction of this center is what happens when the people continue to be policed, but the unjust system doesn't change. So we're policing people, but a system is still corrupt.
Yeah.
And systems are ran by people. So now what do we do that's honest, that's just, to change that edifice that your dad talked about, we got to look at what's creating these situations.
Well, I think it's what we talked about. I mean, learning how to live together. I mean, when you're talking about learning, it's like a little child, when we're teaching children, we're teaching them because, there's something that they don't know. And so, and they're trying to figure it out. So they're like, you ever seen children? They're looking, they're exploring, they're trying to understand all that kind of stuff. We have to begin to do that, but it starts really with honoring the dignity of people. I have to come back to that, because I think some people feel like I know better than those people. These people don't know. They're not business people. They don't understand how this goes. And on the other hand, people feel like, we know what's better over here, but it's understanding where everybody's situated and that we're part of this human family, and we need to figure out what works for humanity and what is balanced, what's equitable, what's fair, all of those things. And as I said, that's work. That's work, but it comes from the heart first that says, I care enough to try this. And it might be a little scary because I'm not used to it. But I want a fair world. I want people to feel like they really matter, And it may, it may be not easy to get there. And as we say, we may not be able to please everybody in the end with the decision, but I keep saying, how you treat me in the process is so critical. And if you even, in this case, how do we get people to understand the inequities? That's what's troubling me, opening the eyes of so many people who don't understand that things always end up in certain kinds of communities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on both sides of the equation, So
the good stuff and the bad stuff.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. We got a lot of work to do. And we just have to we got to do that. My mother said, struggles are never in the process. Freedom's never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. And we got to keep being vigilant and diligent in this process. And we got to create strategy, because without strategy, we'll be banging our head up against a wall over and over again. And that strategy has to be collective and cohesive and coordinated. And we have to be honest about who does what best, and make sure we employ those things so that they work together synergistically, because we can end up sabotaging our own selves if we don't understand how to truly organize all the pieces and the parts to work together synergistically.
Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you.
BCT team, we need to cut that last portion and put it on loop and put it everywhere that the King Center has platforms, because that was a description of the power of strategy and also insight into how we need to talk to each other and learn about each other. And also Dr. King mentioned that nonviolence doesn't acquiesce to injustice, that we don't compromise on justice, that we actually are seekers of true peace, which means we're not just about getting rid of tension. Right. True peace includes justice, which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. defined as love correcting everything that stands against love. We want to encourage you to study with the King Center, to go to the KingCenterInstitute.org and sign up for our online course, to reach out if you need a scholarship for that course. We want to encourage you to join us next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as we conclude this Beloved Community Talk series on environmental justice. And we want to encourage you to join us on July 14th for Be Love Day. Dr. King said, love is the most durable power in the world. And Dr. Bernice A. King just described some of the things that are characteristic of the beloved community. We have to learn to live together. Don't stop the conversation here. Keep it going. Go to our website, click on our Beloved Community Talks link, host these conversations in your homes, in your workplaces. Come back and study nonviolence, because it's the pathway to the beloved community. We believe we can create the beloved community where injustice ceases and love prevails. And again, thank you, Dr. King. Thank you to the panelists. We look forward to seeing you next week.